Hello! So I've been having this urge to make a whimsical costume. The kind of project where I can like totally get lost in the process and go all in and make something kind of impractical and kind of absurd. I've also been really wanting to make a costume for the Renaissance fair just because I'm going later on in the year and I feel like I need to dress the part. And on top of that, there's this sewing pattern that's just been like living rent-free in my brain for the absolute longest time. And that's the moth wing capelet by Minimalist Machinist. This is one of those love at first sight patterns that I just knew I was gonna make someday. It's this like really cute short quilted cape that gives you the look of having moth wings. And it just looks so delightfully cozy. It looks perfect for an autumnal costume and I just love everything about it. But here's the twist. I don't actually want to be a moth. I want to be a spotted lanternfly. Yes, I am talking about those super invasive bugs that have been like absolutely taking over US cities for the past couple years. These guys are really not good for the local ecosystem, so you're pretty much supposed to stomp them the second you see them. And I've actually been battling them up on my roof in my little garden the entire season. They are definitely super annoying, but I also find them really, really beautiful. Just like as an insect, I think they're gorgeous. And I also think there's something kind of funny about taking this insect that is very irritating but also very gorgeous and then making a costume about it. So I was thinking of making a moth capelet with a matching chemise and corset, and that way I have kind of like a cute, dramatic, over-the-top outfit where I can like mix and match the pieces depending on where I'm going and what I'm doing. And I want this to be more than just like a silly outfit because I've been learning a lot of new skills lately and I kind of see this as an opportunity to take all the things I've been learning and put them together to make one big project that just kind of like explores it all. So this whole project is way out of my comfort zone, but I do think that's a part of what makes it so exciting. So let's get started. The first step of this whole project was to print out the pattern for the moth wing capelet, and then to cut out the pattern pieces. Okay, so I cut out my pieces and now I'm gonna try to do my best to explain what it is that I actually have in mind for this project. So this is essentially how this pattern works. There's one big piece that covers both the front and the back, and this folds over your shoulder to give that winged effect, which is so precious. And then there's this back piece, which I might not be able to do this nicely, but this essentially gets tucked under. This kind of goes underneath to make like a hind wing. Hopefully you're kind of seeing that. So what I want to do next is to try to figure out where exactly I'm going to be placing my design elements on these pattern pieces. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at a picture of a lanternfly and kind of break up its wing design elements into different sections and then try to think about how I can recreate those using like tie-dye and shibori effects. Okay, so first I'm going to start with the hind wing, and that's pretty much gonna be this part of the lanternfly. So let me just do some rough sketching and figure out what I want where. Hopefully you can kind of get the gist of what I'm doing here. I'm looking at a picture of the lanternfly and breaking down its wing shape into super basic components. One that represents the red part of the wing, one for the white part, and one for the black part. And then I repeated this process for the main brown wings, which I broke into two sections to represent the two different spot patterns. So for my fabric for this project, I got this 10-yard bolt of white Kona cotton. I know I'm not gonna need all 10 yards, but this was on a really good sale, so I grabbed it. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna unfold this, and then using my pieces that I just drew on, I'm gonna line up the grain lines and try to figure out how much of each section I'm gonna need in fabric. As you can probably tell, nothing about this step was super precise at all. I ended up giving myself a ton of extra fabric for each part of the wings to not only account for shrinking, but also to give myself a lot of extra fabric to work with. I'm gonna be hand dyeing all of these pieces, and it would be really nice to be able to pick the nicest parts of each fabric to include in the final design. So I'm giving myself plenty of extra room just so I have options. Okay, so the first pieces I'm gonna tackle for this project are gonna be the big, like, front and hind wing pieces, I guess. It's these two big pieces right here. On the actual lanternfly itself, these wings have kind of like a taupey brown background color. So I'm gonna start this whole project by first dyeing these pieces of fabric which are for these pieces, that kind of like taupe brown color, at least as close as I can get to that. I'm also gonna stick into this dye bath this white cloak. I got this for Ryan so he can coordinate with me at the Ren Fair and we can match in terms of color as much as possible. For this first round of dyeing, I mixed together 3 different fiber reactive dyes in the colors Mist Gray, Better Black, and Brazil Nut. Like I said, my goal was to create that kind of taupe-ish brown background color as the base for my main wings, which I'll then dye again with some tie-dye effects to get the full effect that I'm looking for. I decided to first tub dye this fabric so that when I'm tying and dyeing later on, there won't be any of that pure stark white color from the original fabric showing through. I just wanted to tone down that white as much as I could. I then repeated this process for the red section of the wings using a combination of dynamite and oxblood red. My goal here was to create a light red background and to hopefully not have it turn out neon pink. And here are how my 2 tub dyed fabrics turned out. The red one turned out perfectly, but my attempt at a brown turned out a little more gray than I had hoped. But it's okay, this is still gonna work out perfectly as the foundation for some crazy tie-dye effects. I'm actually gonna set these aside for a moment so I can work on my other 2 fabrics first. Alright, so I now have a big piece of that like brown gray fabric and a big piece of the red fabric. And now all that's left to figure out is what I'm gonna do with these last 2 sections, which is this one here, which on the actual Lanternfly is white, and this section here, which on the actual Lanternfly is black. Now technically I don't actually really need to do much to these fabrics to achieve black and white. I mean, the fabric's already white, I could just leave it as is. And I could just dye the other piece solidly black and just call it good, but I want to push it a little bit further and try to achieve some depth in these fabrics with these colors. And I'm going to do that with ice dyeing. If you've been around my channel for a while, you've definitely seen me ice dye stuff before. That is a process that I just absolutely adore. It's how I made this shirt. And I think it could be a really fun way to add some depth and character to these pieces. So let me explain really quick how that works. When you get a tub of dye, let's say like this mist gray right here, which is what I used earlier, this dye is made up of a ton of pigments that create the mist gray color. So there might be like yellows and blues and reds and things that are put in this pot so that when you take a spoonful of this dye and you put it in water just like I did, all those pigments are gonna mix together and create a homogeneous mist gray color, which you then, can like dip your stuff in and dye to get this color. If instead of taking a spoonful of this and dissolving it in water first, I instead take this powder and sprinkle it over some ice. What happens is when the ice very slowly melts, all those pigments that make up the mist gray start to separate from one another. And that's where you get these like really cool, kind of crazy watery tie-dye effects because the pigments will separate and they'll hit the fabrics in different places. And there might be moments where you get this like mist gray predictable color that you expected, but for the most part, you're just gonna kind of get like unpredictable results. And I think that's a whole lot of fun. And I think that's exactly what this project needs. So for my white section, I am gonna use this mist gray. I'm gonna use it very sparingly, and my goal is that it's just gonna kind of give like a dusting of color over the white. I want it to be predominantly white with just like a little bit of character. Then for my black fabric, I'm gonna use these 2 dyes right here. This is Thundercloud and Better Black. Thundercloud is mostly blacks and grays. It doesn't have a whole lot of surprises in it, but the Better Black is made up of a lot of different pigments. So I think if I use these strategically, like stick mostly with the Thundercloud with like a little hint of Better Black, my hope is that this fabric is going to be blacks, grays, whites, and just maybe like little hints of other hues in there. I hope. That's what I'm aiming for, and we'll see what actually happens. Okay, so let's start with this quote unquote white fabric. What I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna shove it in here and scrunch it up. And what this is gonna do is that it's gonna create like peaks and valleys, like these deep crevices in here where dye either will or won't hit. So the dye is more likely to hit in these like tall exposed places, but these places that are kind of like tucked in, the dye is less likely to hit, and that's gonna help create that like super organic look. Okay, now I'm gonna go put on my gloves and a respirator, and we're gonna get to the dyeing process. When dyeing with fiber reactive dyes, you not only need to sprinkle on some dye powder, but also soda ash, which fixes color to the fabric. I usually use a really rough ratio of 1 teaspoon of dye powder to 1 tablespoon of soda ash, which I never actually measure and I just kind of eyeball. And here I'm applying the colors for my black fabric, which are Thundercloud and Better Black. I left those to melt, and then once the ice was completely melted, I left them for another 24 hours just to continue soaking up all of the color. The next day, I removed the fabrics from their dye baths and rinsed them out. Fabrics that are ice dyed always look super dark and murky right out of the dye bath and even after rinsing them a few times. So this might look like a total failure, like a boring, solid piece of black fabric now, but here's how it looked after it was fully washed and dried. This is exactly what I was aiming for. It's a predominantly black fabric, but with some depth and character. There are some pinks and reds and purples and blues hidden in there, and I just think it's perfect. And here's how my white fabric turned out. This one somehow turned out a little more bold and graphic than I'd intended, but I actually really like it with these pops of deep purple, gray, and green. Overall, I definitely think these were a success. Alrighty, so here I have my 2 biggest pieces of fabric, the ones that are now gonna get some polka dots on them. And how I plan on doing that is actually really similar in technique to how I did my shirt. I'm just gonna use like really simple tie-dye folding techniques just to achieve those little black polka dots that are all over the Lanternfly. So creating a ring is pretty simple. You basically just figure out where you want it, locate that spot, like, okay, I want my polka dot right here, and then pinch that, and then kind of pull the fabric down so you end up with a little point. Then you just take a rubber band. I really like these super tiny hair elastics. I don't want these polka dots to be too big, so I'm pretty much just gonna go down like 1/2 inch and just tie it off. Then you have this tiny little guy just poking straight out of the fabric. Yeah, that's it for the tying part. Super easy. It is gonna take me a while because I do want to try to cover as much of this fabric as possible. So I'm just gonna hang out here on the couch, zone out with my cat, watch some YouTube, and make the most of it. After many hours of tying up these fabrics, here's how my red one turned out. It kind of looks like a weird sea creature, like a sea anemone. And now it's time to dye each one of these little tips black just to give this fabric some black polka dots. Normally, to add color in specific parts of a tied up fabric, I'd use a little dropper or a pipette to apply the liquid dye. But I accidentally forgot my whole stash of pipettes back at my parents' house. So I came up with this kind of dumb but actually pretty effective way to apply the black dye, which was literally just dipping each tip into the cup of dye. Would I actually recommend this method? Absolutely not, but it worked well enough for now. Once all the tips were blackened, I put the fabric in a large plastic bin and covered the whole thing with a layer of ice. And then I dusted it with some dynamite, oxblood red, and some soda ash to fix the color. Then after the 24+ hours of setting, I rinsed and untied the whole fabric. You might assume looking at this that untying the fabric would be just as annoying as tying it up, if not even more annoying. But because I was using this really strong quilting cotton, I could literally just pull it apart and all the little bands would just pop right off. And as a bonus, since I didn't have to cut them, I could now reuse these bands in future dyeing projects. And here's how my red fabric turned out after a full wash and dry cycle. I really like how this fabric turned out. It's a black and red polka dot fabric, but with a little extra something, which is exactly what I was going for. I really like all these layers of color. The background has this cool watercolory red and pink look, and the spots aren't just pure black. There are grays and purples and reds, and then the spots themselves are these really interesting irregular shapes. It's basically exactly what I was going for. All right, so here is the next piece I made. This is that big gray piece that I dyed previously. I tied it up exactly like I did the red one, and this one actually took me almost 3 hours to tie up. It was such a beast to tackle. I'd actually bought a pack of 500 little rubber bands to use between the red piece and this piece, and this is actually all I have left. That's maybe like 20 rubber bands or so. So I've done a lot of rubber band twist tying in this very short period of time, and I'm feeling it in my hands. Just like with the red piece, I'm gonna be using Better Black, which I'm gonna use a little pipette to administer. I finally found my pipette, so this will hopefully make things a lot easier. So let's do this, and then we're gonna ice dye it. As you can probably imagine, having the right tool to do this made the process so much easier. This time, to ice dye this fabric, I mixed up a few different dye colors and my soda ash into an old spice jar shaker. So in here I have Mist Gray, Brazil Nut, and Blood Moon. Putting them all together in a jar like this basically ensures that all of the colors are going to be spread out super evenly and that there aren't going to be any clumps or concentrated sections of just one color. Because I also pre-made quite a lot of this mixture, which I won't use all of on this piece, it also ensures that I'll have this exact mixture of colors to use again for my last few fabrics, just to keep things somewhat consistent. After melting and setting, here's what my fabric looked like when it was still in the dye bath, which is always really dark and concerning looking, but I just had to trust that the ice dye did its thing and that there'd be a ton of fun colors and textures that would appear after the wash. And thankfully they did. Here's how the finished fabric turned out, and I really love it. It's mostly browns and grays with tons of little pops of color throughout the whole thing. There are even little moments where there are literally rainbow speckles, which makes me so happy. So I have one more piece of my Lanternfly to work on, and that is this part of the wing right here, which definitely has a really different look and feel than all the other wing parts. So I thought I would try a technique that I've never actually done before just to achieve this kind of like, it's not quite a grid, but a more like blocky, like little squares kind of feeling. So I wanted to try a really specific shibori tying and dyeing technique to achieve this effect. And I actually already prepared the piece right here. This is what it looks like. Basically what this technique is that I took my piece of gray fabric that we dyed together and just folded it and did like a running stitch by hand with some really, really strong cotton yarn. So this is just essentially made up of like teeny tiny little pleats. I wanted them to be really irregular and uneven and to kind of undulate and move in and out. So you can definitely see that more on the back side, like what my lines actually look like. I was going for organic, I was going for natural, I was going for buggy, and hopefully this will get me there. Oh, and in case you're wondering how long this actually took me to achieve, it ended up taking me just over 7 hours to finish this fabric. Like a little over 7 hours of hand sewing to get this done. And my hands hurt. So now what I can do is take this and just yank it on both sides. And that'll create this absolutely crazy kind of like pleated effect. So only some of the fabric is actually gonna be exposed to dye, and everything that's like inside these folds is gonna be hidden. And that should create a really cool tie-dye look. So let's scrunch up the rest of this fabric and we'll see how it turns out. Because this little scrunched up guy was in kind of an odd shape and I didn't have a good container for it, I ended up making kind of a wall with this plastic lid. I then used that dye shaker from before to sprinkle my mixture of dyes right onto the fabric. Putting this dye under the ice instead of on top of it will make sure that these colors hit the fabric first, which will make them more dramatic and sharp. Then I covered the mixture with a layer of ice, and then I sprinkled some better black on top. Then I dusted it with soda ash. So here's a little preview of how that fabric turned out. It is definitely really dark right now just because it's wet and it hasn't been rinsed, but the effect is there and I am so relieved. So I'm gonna spend absolutely forever taking out all these threads and then I'll show it to you when it's done. All right, I don't mean to toot my own horn here, but I absolutely adore how this fabric turned out. This might be one of my best ice dyes yet. It looks exactly like I had hoped, with these little kind of squares in a tiny little line, and the colors are just spot on. Ugh, I'm actually so sad that I have to cut this up. And here's how all of my fabrics look together, and I'm really, really happy with this collection. I think it definitely captures exactly what I was going for. They're interesting, they're dynamic, they're moody, and they're kind of buggy, which I love. Alrighty, so I have my beautiful fabrics. I'm actually really happy with how all of them turned out, and now it's time for the really hard part, which is actually cutting into them and turning them into something. I'm definitely nervous for this stage just because I spent so much time on these fabrics. I know that if I mess them up, I'm gonna be heartbroken, but I have faith that I can pull this off. I think the first thing I'm gonna work on are the two like huge main body wings, which feature these two fabrics here. I kind of figured those are like the simplest in their design, so it's kind of like a good primer to get this whole thing going and to build my confidence. So let's start on these wings. To make things just a little bit easier for myself, I decided to cut up my paper pattern pieces so that each color section had its own pattern piece. And then, just to get it over with, I started with my favorite fabric first. I laid it out, and then I played around with placing the pattern pieces in the areas of the fabric that I liked the most. Because of the really random nature of ice dyeing, some areas are just a bit more interesting than others. This is basically why I gave myself so much extra fabric to work with in each color. It gives me a lot of freedom to make sure that each piece is as perfect as it can be. But a downside of this freedom is that I have a tendency to overthink the placements and I spend way too long trying out every possible layout. But it's okay, I got there eventually. I then repeated this process for my brown spotted fabric. Next, I had to assemble the pieces to get them into that full wing shape. So first, I connected the two gray pieces. And then I attached them to the brown spotted piece. And then I repeated this process with the other wing. Okay, so for this hind wing, I'm gonna do basically the exact same thing as I did for the big wings, but I'm gonna cut this into 1, 2, 3, 4 separate pieces just to make like the actual piecing process easier. This is gonna be black, this is gonna be white, and then these two are gonna be red. So let's do it. For this piece, I did decide I wanted to make the white section just a tiny bit bigger, so I'm just gonna move this line down just a little bit.
Here you can totally see some of that overthinking taking place. Believe it or not, I actually cut out a lot of footage of me just flipping and rotating all 3 of the fabrics over and over again, just trying to find that perfect spot. Oh, also, I just want to mention really quick, if you notice that my hands are looking real bad, like some of my fingernails are blue and things are just generally discolored, I promise that I'm okay. I was doing some indigo dyeing that weekend and my glove totally broke and my hands got really badly stained, which is so hard to wash out. So I'm sorry for the ugly colors.
Finally starting to come together and I could not be more excited. So I'm gonna start assembling these pieces. First, I'm gonna attach here and here. Then I'm gonna attach this guy and it'll open up and it should be a beautiful lanternfly wing. So let's do it.
Before attaching that final longer red piece, I first trimmed the edges of the main piece so I'd have a nice straight line to work with. But somehow I only had the absolute dullest rotary cutter to help me do that job, but eventually we got there. And here's how all of the wings are turning out so far. Do you see the lanternfly yet?
I could not be more thrilled with how this is turning out. This is like exactly what I envisioned this project looking like in my head, and I'm just like so excited to see it through and to see it done and to actually wear it. I was actually so excited to get this done that I completely forgot that I needed a lining for this whole project. So I was all ready to like cut out my batting and put this whole thing together and try to finish it today, and then I stopped and I was like, wait, I literally can't do that. I'm missing like a huge amount of fabric. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use up the rest of that Kona cotton, that white cotton that we started this whole project with, and I'm just gonna color that with the exact same method that you saw me do for literally all these other pieces. I'm just gonna do a really, really simple ice dye using a little bit of all of the colors from every single one of these ice dye events. That way my goal is hopefully to create just like a very simple fabric with a lot of movement, similar to this black one here, that just kind of like ties everything in and ties it all together. Hopefully I'm gonna have enough fabric to not only use it for the lining, but to also use that same fabric for the binding of this capelet, and then also for at least the lining of the corset. I'm still trying to figure out whether or not I want the corset to look like this and to just like use up all the scraps from this whole process so it like exactly coordinates, or if I want it to coordinate with just the lining of the capelet, if that makes sense. I think that's one of those things that I'm only gonna really have an answer once I actually see how the lining fabric turns out, so let's go do that. got some fabric. So this fabric, I actually ended up doing the ice dye that I showed you in the time lapse, and then I pulled it out and I was like, I don't like it. So then I tub dyed it and then I ice dyed it again. And eventually I came up with a result that I'm pretty happy with. The first time it just came out way too bright. It was like this beautiful pink that I actually felt really bad over dyeing because I thought the fabric itself was gorgeous, but it just like did not match with any part of my Lanternfly costume. And this is all the fabric I have left, so I had to make it work. I actually think this works a lot better. I have some of those deep reds, I got some browns, I got some grays. It actually coordinates, it brings the whole project like a little bit of warmth, and I think it's perfect. I did, however, end up ruining my hands even more, as if they didn't look like dirty and gross enough. I actually, like when I was doing this whole process, was wearing these gloves again, and the glove broke again, and so now it looks like I have zombie hands. I've tried everything to wash it. It, I think, just needs some time, and unfortunately, I don't really have a lot of time. I have to get this project done, so forgive my kind of dirty looking hands. I swear they're clean. So yes, this fabric's gonna become the capelet lining, it's gonna become the capelet binding, and then hopefully I'm gonna have more than enough to work with so that I can also make my little corset. So let's cut out the lining pieces and then figure out how we're gonna quilt this thing.
The first piece that I assembled is the capelet's neck facing, which is actually a part of the garment that when you're wearing it, you won't see it at all, which is great for me because it gives me the chance to figure all of this out. Oh yeah, did I mention that this is my first time ever quilting anything? So I sandwiched 2 pieces of my lining fabric with some ultra thin batting in between. And then I took this whole assemblage to my sewing machine to quilt them together using some golden brown thread. For the quilting, I decided to make lines that travel vertically down each wing like the veins that you'd see on an actual bug's wing.
I finally have a quilted piece of fabric for this project, and that feels really good. It's kind of feeling like this is starting to become something, even though it's only a neck facing. I still have a lot to do. This took me absolutely forever, and those wings are giant. So I know this is gonna take me literally all day. I'm just gonna like blast some music and make the most of it. So let's get to it.
And instead of listening to music, I ended up binging an entire season of Survivor while I worked on these wings. Yes, an entire season. That's how long it took me to finish quilting all of these giant wings.
I started the quilting process around 10 a.m. I think. It is now 6 p.m. and all my wings are finally done. That was an experience, to say the least.
But the night wasn't over yet. I still had a lot more work to do. Using a big piece of that same fabric that I used for my lining, I cut out some bias strips, which I then turned into double fold bias tape using a bias tape maker and my iron. Then I used this bias tape to bind all of the edges of my wings.
Good morning. So, my pieces are all bound. I'm really excited about this and I really like how it turned out. I think this color actually ended up perfect. I was also nervous about applying the bias binding because that's like a skill that's new to me, but I feel like after today, I feel like I conquered it. Anyway, today's all about finishing this whole capelet. We're gonna put the whole thing together. We're gonna do all the little finishing details. We're gonna clean the whole thing up and hopefully it's gonna be fantastic. So let's get to it.
Assembling this cape was actually a lot more straightforward than I thought it would be. I don't know, I just assumed that this was gonna be super hard and super complicated, but I basically just had to line up all of the notches on the wings and the neck facing and stitch everything together. As I was assembling the cape and watching my vision of a lanternfly appear before me, I was honestly getting super excited. I've never done a project that was this big and this detailed, like where every single step involved so much care and so much effort. I usually don't take on big, intricate sewing projects specifically, like literally ever, but I enjoyed every single moment of this project so much. And I really feel like I pushed myself way out of my comfort zone and grew a lot over this experience. And I'm really excited to keep exploring and seeing what I can do next. And I also want to take this moment to give a huge shout out and a big thank you to my patrons who help support my creative adventures. Your generosity helps give me these opportunities to go wild and make these crazy projects, and I am so grateful. Anyway, enough of my sappiness. Once the majority of the capelet was assembled, I had to do some little details with hand sewing. Which honestly might be one of my least favorite activities ever, but I pushed through. I then had basically exactly enough of my lining fabric left over to create my coordinating corset. I used a sewing pattern called the Emma Breeze corset, which I found on Etsy and I picked out specifically because it had a really helpful video tutorial to accompany the pattern. And then I lined it with a black coutil, which is a really strong cotton fabric that's commonly used in corsetry. I gave it some eyelets, and then I tied it up with a brown cotton cord that I'd also dyed with the lining fabric.
Okay, so I have my finished capelet, which I'm so excited about. I cleaned up all the threads, I finished the binding. I actually ended up throwing it in the washing machine for 2 really intense wash dry cycles. I wanted to kind of beat it up a little bit just because this quilting was like super stiff right after finishing it, and I wanted to be able to wear it right away. So instead of breaking it in like you would break in a quilt, you know, and just like cuddling up with it, I needed to do that a lot faster, so I threw it in the wash. And I actually think it helped a lot. I was definitely scared when I first pulled it out of the washing machine because it was so wrinkly, and I was like, oh no, I just ruined my whole project. But after ironing it, it's perfect, and I'll show you how it turned out when we get to the reveal. I gotta tease just a little bit. Then, while this was washing, I worked on my corset. I'm actually really happy with how this came out. I don't even know if technically I can actually call it a corset just because it did have like boning in every single channel at some point, but I put it on and I was wearing this like really structured thing, and I was like, do I actually want to go to a Renaissance fair all like cinched and snatched? And I kind of just decided that I wanted to go for comfort, so I only really put boning where it mattered structurally, like to support the eyelets, and I'm actually really happy with it. I think the tie-dye looks really cool. And this is something that I can definitely wear outside of this costume too for like future Ren Fair costumes, because it's pretty neutral, so it could go with like a lot of different costume themes. So yeah. The last thing to do on my list is to make a chemise. Similar to this corset, I kind of want this to just be like a generic Renaissance fair chemise that I can wear in future costumes just as like an underlayer. So I definitely want to keep this pretty simple and pretty straightforward. But I did find a fabric that I'm really excited about, so let me show you that. So at my local thrift store, I found for only like literally $2 this absolutely massive bed skirt that has this really beautiful lacy bit on the bottom that I think will be really cute for the bottom of a dress, just to have some like nice lace peeking out. So I'm gonna transform this massive piece of fabric into something wearable, I found a really simple pattern online. I'll include links in this video's description. It seems easy enough. It's just like a couple rectangles and some strategic lace placement. So let's get to it.
And here's how my spotted lanternfly Renaissance Fair costume turned out. And Ryan went as a lanternfly exterminator, complete with a custom leather fly swatter. I am so happy with how this project turned out. It is literally exactly how I envisioned it, and it honestly might be one of my favorite things that I've made so far.
A lanternfly!
Thank you so much for watching this video, especially if you stayed until the end. I know this was a long one, but I really wanted to share every single detail of this project with you. Definitely let me know what you think, and hopefully I'll see you in my next video. Bye!